We are a few weeks removed from the James Harden trade debacle, and even after having plenty of time to reflect, I still truly do not know what the hell went on. The Brooklyn Nets' Big Three was supposed to dominate the league for years to come, but suddenly, in a blink, that team is no longer together. What the hell happened? According to my analytics, damn near all of you guys watching this video are men, and a fun, or I guess not so fun fact, is that 2 out of every 3 men experience some form of male pattern baldness by the time they reach the age of 35. These videos on average get about 50,000 views, so that means there are at least 30,000 men watching this video right now who could really use today's sponsor, Keeps. Keeps is a clinically proven hair loss treatment that will combat the symptoms of male pattern baldness. Treatment plans are extremely affordable. In fact, you're getting them at about 50% the price you would for most other pharmaceutical items for this. And these plans are personalized with 24/7 expert support. This is a subscription service that will be delivered right to your door. These treatment plans come doctor recommended, and whether you are looking to grow more hair, treat losing hair, or just simply take better care of the hair that you currently have, you will more than likely see results within the first 6 months, as most consumers do. Hair loss stops with Keeps. To get 50% off of your first order, go to keeps.com/rustybuckets. Again, that is keeps.com/rustybuckets. Shout out to Keeps for sponsoring this video, and let's get on with the topic. To understand the end to James Harden's relatively brief time in Brooklyn, we need to go back to its origins. When James Harden was on his way out of Houston, he released a list of his preferred destinations for a trade. With 2 years and a player option left on his contract, he did not have all the leverage in the world, and with no momentum with a potential trade and things stalling more and more over that time, his list began to grow. But that list originally started off with just 2 teams. Now, after being traded to Philadelphia, James Harden in a press conference claimed that he only wanted to be in Philadelphia, that was the #1 destination from him from the very beginning, leaving Houston. And because of my foggy memory about the situation, I figured the Nets were one of those last teams that Harden mentioned on his list of landing spots. But no, as it turns out, when Harden originally listed just 2 teams he wanted to be traded to, those teams were the Philadelphia 76ers and the Brooklyn Nets. He quickly expanded that list to include the Heat and the Bucks, and then it became a ton more teams, but either way, those were the first 2 spots that came to mind when it was time for him to get out of Houston. So while he did express interest in being in Philadelphia at that time, it would be wrong to retroactively treat it as though he was not interested in the idea of playing with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, because if he wasn't, that team would not have been one of his first 2 options. Now, that does not mean he can't change his mind, so this is not some gotcha, but, you know, it's worthy of note. His first season in Brooklyn is weird to reflect on now with the season happening this year in context. A lot of people, including myself, would have told you that this was the best version of James Harden, the version that was less aggressive with his own scoring and focused more on playmaking. Not that Harden was not a playmaker before, because he absolutely was. He'd averaged double-digit assists before, but the way he was playing was actually giving me similar vibes to Wilt Chamberlain in 1967. Yes, I realize this is a very random comparison, but Wilt in 67 is like one of my favorite overall basketball case studies to bring up at any chance that I get, so please indulge me. Wilt Chamberlain in 1966 averaged 33 points per game, and he was taking 25 shots per game to do it, shooting 54% from the field. The Sixers are good, but a one-man show, and ultimately that resulted in them being a disappointing team in the postseason. Over that offseason, the Sixers hired a new coach who gained the respect of Wilt Chamberlain, unlike their former coach, and with that respect, he was able to get Wilt to shoot the ball way less and pass more. Wilt that season in 1967 averaged 24 points on 14 shots, shooting 68% from the field. 24 points on 68% shooting is absolutely bonkers. He averaged 8 assists, and his teammates, who were previously mediocre, were way better. In fact, I believe 2 of them made the All-Star game after being considered just okay players. The team was more well-rounded, and as a result, the Sixers won it all, and they were one of the best teams of all time. The only fundamental difference between the 66 Sixers and the 67 Sixers is Wilt Chamberlain shot the ball less. This to me proves three things, two of which are fundamental principles as to how I view the game. Less is very often more in basketball. 2. High volume scoring seasons are severely overrated because times when players average like 35 plus points per game, they never result in anything. I believe 32 points per game is the highest average of a championship team ever, and that would be Michael Jordan's average. And the third, and this is not a principle, it's just kind of a side tangent, I think Wilt Chamberlain is overrated because the high numbers that he scored were kind of proven by this case study to not actually be that valuable. But he was really, really good. And really, if he would have just been this player for his entire career, he would have won a lot more and have been a better player. But the reason people prop Wilt Chamberlain so high is these all-time numbers. It's kind of the John Stockton syndrome where if he didn't have these crazy numbers, he'd actually be a better player. But it's because of those crazy numbers that he is thought of so highly. It's a weird paradox. Anyways, the point is, James Harden in his first year in Brooklyn had some 67 Wilt vibes in that less was more and it seemed to be better for winning and also just more fun to watch. He was far more selective, and I just liked the overall approach he had to being in Brooklyn. But injury in the second round, and when he came back this year, it was just not the same. Now, this is in part due to that injury, but based on how quickly he turned things around in Philly, I'd say it's fair to assume that injury was not as big of a factor as originally thought. What made Harden in year 2 in Brooklyn so much worse than Harden in year 1? Well, there are two main reasons I can really pin this thing on, and one of them I can explain easier and have more knowledge of just inherently, but let's explain the more difficult one first. After the Harden trade went through, there were a lot of reports coming out from both sides in regards to the situation in the locker room. Apparently, Harden took a rather large issue, much more than most, with Kyrie Irving's part-time status. He believed it showed a lack of commitment to the team and a lack of winning, and a lack of interest and commitment to winning, that is. And that anger and issue exceeded past just being upset with Kyrie Irving. He was also upset with his teammates for being okay with the situation. His issues with Kyrie became issues with everybody else, and that was reflected in the reports on Brooklyn's side of things, which suggested that pretty much everybody in Brooklyn's locker room was relieved when Harden was no longer there. Bruce Brown literally said the locker room was instantaneously better as soon as it was a different situation, so doesn't leave a lot of room to question things. There was a very, very clear divide in that locker room, and it was between James Harden and everybody else. And it is pretty damn hard to play basketball the way you're supposed to at the elite level that you're used to when you are borderline at war with your own team. Now, the extent and impact of that conflict will never truly be known because we were not in that locker room. Maybe a documentary 20 years from now, but that's about it. But at the end of the day, chemistry was a clear factor to me, and James Harden being worse. I put a ton of value on chemistry and how players perform. I think it's one of the biggest reasons why teams like the Miami Heat well exceed their expectations and teams like the Brooklyn Nets fall apart. And it's also a big reason why he was not wanted there anymore and he no longer wanted to be there, so why he ended up being traded. Okay, I talked about this at length in my Sixers video, so as a result, I am not going to harp on this point for too long, but it is a really huge factor, so I have to mention it. There was an inherent flaw with the construction of the Brooklyn Nets roster from the very beginning, and that was when James Harden was paired with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. The problem less came down to the idea of there not being enough shots and that egos would get in the way of everyone getting theirs, but rather just how those shots were taken. The title card is time of possession, because the fundamental difference between someone like Joel Embiid, with how Harden is playing in Philly now, and Kyrie Irving or Kevin Durant is Embiid catches the ball in the post and he makes a decision with the ball almost immediately. He is shooting or passing within 5 seconds of a catch, usually even less time than that actually. Meanwhile, someone like Kyrie Irving will dribble 20 seconds off of the shot clock before the ball has swung back to James Harden, and I don't think that's really conducive to Harden's play style. Now, to be clear, this is not necessarily a criticism of Kyrie Irving. That's not necessarily a good thing, but Kyrie Irving is very clearly a proven good NBA player and a player who wins with his play style, so it's not like I'm knocking his play style as inherently an issue. But paired next to James Harden, it is a big issue, because that means you are dribbling the whole possession while James Harden is just sitting there. Now, this does speak to some of the key inherent flaws with Harden as a player, the fact that without the ball constantly in his hands, he is not engaged and he is not making plays. But at the end of the day, Harden is what he is, and if you do not accommodate for his flaws, you get situations like this with the Nets. If you want to play the argument of, well, James Harden should play off ball, that's cute, that's great, but he doesn't, so figure it out from there. So when we look at this roster from a construction standpoint, it is pretty clear this team should have never really been together to begin with. We're going to remember this team as the team that had the 3 greatest isolation players, or at least the greatest accumulation of 3 isolation players on one team. That isn't actually good. It's not. Like 3 players who score in a similar way on the same team at the volume that they do it, it's not a good fit. And all of this accumulated in the Nets falling apart. Now you could argue the injury factor and Kyrie Irving's vaccine stuff, that doesn't happen under normal circumstances. We don't normally have a pandemic and an anti-vax shit going on. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. So I do think those were factors, but I also think it didn't take much to push this stuff over the edge. Back when I and many others said that Harden to Brooklyn was a bad idea, turns out we were actually right. Oh, I know it looked bad for a while. It looked like we were fucking idiots, but ultimately, those types of star players are a poor fit in the long run. Again, not for shots or ego, but just how they play off of each other. And those personalities were so large that a clear divide in the locker room ruined chemistry, and that was always going to be a possibility. The big positive here is that both sides seem to have walked away relatively happy. The Brooklyn Nets might have actually gotten better just because Ben is more the yin to the Nets yang, while James Harden was just a lot more yang. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia 76ers were in need of that yang. This metaphor is going everywhere. And Harden ended up back with another one of his top 2 teams, so he got exactly what he wanted, and I think both teams are better for it. A lot of people are getting mad at Harden and throwing criticism his way. Honestly, to me, like, I like him in Philly. I like the Nets as they are now more than I liked them before. To me, this is a positive. Maybe James Harden complains a little too much and is a little too frequent in the conflict department with other star players, but I'm not putting a bunch of emphasis on that, basically. But that is what went wrong with James Harden in Brooklyn. Shout out to Riddy for editing this video, but that is the end of this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe for more NBA content like this, and cue the outro music.